felt some conflicting things about microphones, but I think we're cool now. Obviously. You can all hear me, right? Yeah. Party time, let's go. Okay, so this talk is called Code as a Job, as you heard. And a little bit about me before we start. I can't speak German. I learned in high school, I know a little bit, but I won't subject you to any of that. I can speak a number of other languages, most of them computer languages, and I've been doing that for a number of years. But I actually stopped doing that last year. I took a year off, and that's been a weird change in my life. Because before that, I was really involved in technical communities. I contributed a little bit to open source, mostly kind of behind the scenes stuff. I organized a bunch of community groups, and I did a lot of writing, both blog posts. I wrote a bunch of blog posts, and I wrote a book, and I wrote some articles and that kind of stuff. But anyway, all that is sort of getting to the point, which is I was a conference speaker, did a lot of conference speaking before I stopped programming. And one of the last talks that I gave was called Bacon is Bad for You. And this is sort of a sequel to that talk. And it was, I guess it was a couple of years ago, but it's still sort of the same idea. And this is one of the slides from that talk, and it's actually it's from a blog post that sort of inspired that entire talk. And so this is a guy who was at the end of his life, and he was looking back on his career working in advertising. But if you read even just like the highlighted parts of this, like you may see some distinct similarities between advertising and between development, between what we do. Like, for instance, they brag about who's had the least sleep and the most takeaway food. Like, does that sound like a hackathon to anybody else? And his conclusion to all of this is, speaking to his colleagues and former colleagues, I think you're all fucking mad. And he's saying that because he thinks their priorities are completely screwed up. Because what they're doing is ultimately not super important. They're not curing cancer, they're not world leaders, they're just making advertisements. But we're not gonna talk about advertising, and we're not gonna talk about the thing I talked about in a different talk, obviously. Try to talk about something new. So the topic of tonight's talk is actually writing better code. But how we get to writing better code, I think, is something that we can re-examine, because we talk a lot about like the kind of stuff that Christian just mentioned, like, you know, choosing the right framework, or functional versus objective-oriented programming, and those are all useful things, but we don't typically talk about some other aspects of writing better code that are what I want to explore. So specifically, I want to talk about all the bullshit that goes on around technical communities that tries to suck us into it. It's not actually helping us write better code at all. But most importantly, I want to talk about treating writing your code as a job, and treating a job as something that's important and you need to do well, and how those two concepts can cooperate with each other. So what that article that I just showed you was basically talking about was exploitation, right? And in order to work in this industry, or any such industry that, you know, asks us to sacrifice food and sleep for the sake of our jobs, we kind of have to be like down with, yay, I'm going to be exploited and it's going to be awesome. And that's sort of par for the course. This is from, I'm assuming a lot of people saw the Amazon article in the New York Times. Did a bunch of you read that? Okay, some of you read that. That's good. If you haven't, you might be interested in reading it. It's long, but it's very damning, I think. But this dude here, he's talking about how working at Amazon is an acquired taste, which is basically a nice way of saying it tastes like shit. And he's talking about all these things that people have to put up with at Amazon. And that, like, if you read the article, like, there's no way that you would read this article and be like, those are reasonable things for people to put up with. Like, you would have a reaction, and I'm going to paraphrase this. I should have just copied it, like the one that Paul Graham did, where he was like, "Oh, these people are a bunch of whiners because they don't want to be coddled." Like, perhaps you could have that reaction, but you still understand on some level, whether you're like, yay, Amazon, this is a great way to run your business, or not, that you're pushing people as far as you can push them, and then pushing them a little bit more. And yeah, to say that's an acquired taste, I think, is a bit of an understatement. But that's how a meritocracy works. Like that's how this concept drives itself. Like if you complain about it, then you don't have any merit. But you can't complain about the system that's supposed to be rewarding you, right? That's one of the cool aspects of meritocracy, is that it's an emperor's new clothes type thing. Like you have to award it importance in order for your work to be important. Any merit that it rewards you, if that means anything, it has to be because you say that the meritocratic system as a whole is important and is just and is fair. Better example of this is, you remember the Startup Castle thing? Did y'all read the Startup Castle thing? No? Nobody's heard of this. Okay, well. It'll be a fun fairy tale for us to share together then. So once upon a time in a town called San Francisco, or somewhere near, I'm assuming, there was a beautiful castle full of startup nerds, I believe, and they wanted some other startup nerds to come live with them in their beautiful, idyllic castle. But not just any startup nerds. These needed to be people who were like themselves, who subscribe to the same meritocratic notions that they already have. So what they say here is, we've been trying different things for a while, and these seem to be the common threads among ourselves and the most successful and trustworthy people we've lived with before. So what they're saying is, we have judged ourselves to be successful and trustworthy. And in order to demonstrate, to prove that we are in fact successful and trustworthy, we're going to find other people who agree that we are successful and trustworthy based on the criteria we've laid out, and they want to prove that they're successful and trustworthy so that they can be successful and trustworthy like us. Like, if this starts to seem like it's all just like making nothing out of the ether, like that's the point I'm trying to make. So like, if you like, since nobody's seen this, I feel like I should read it all to you because it's hilarious, but I will let you look it up yourself. Just to make a few points from it though, like they're not talking about things like you need to know at least, how to write hello world in JavaScript. They're talking about things like you can't wear makeup more than once a week, or you can't have any bills that get paid by somebody else. Like things that have nothing at all to do with startups, software development, anything. And the problem with something like that is that you're creating a system where a lot of people are getting set up to fail, essentially. And when people fail, it's their own fault. There's a really easy way to blame them, even though it actually has nothing to do with them. It may actually be something like you wear makeup more than once a week or something like that. It can be completely arbitrary, but we create ways to blame it on people, to blame it on ourselves. It's always our fault. There's some technical reason that we're not getting the success we want, or our code isn't working even. And it all comes down to our personal responsibility, our personal failures, too easily. And basically, you can sum all that stuff up by saying, you're not going to do well if you're not passionate enough. And I just want to say for the record that passion is poison. I believe that very strongly. When you hear that word, like, get out, like at least be very skeptical if you don't just outright run in the opposite direction. But regardless of what passion does to you and like your lifestyle and your health and whatever, I hope you will at least believe me that it ruins what would have been perfectly good code. And one reason is that something that we know because it's been studied like 14 zillion times and proved over and over again. The more you work, the less productive you are. And if you refer back to that Amazon article, interestingly enough, they're making a case or attempting to make a case for working more hours. And the way that they say that they do that is by just churning through people, burning them out, and then getting rid of them. But like even that doesn't actually work. Really, what's happening if we're sacrificing productivity, knowing that productivity is going to go down if we overwork people? What we're doing is essentially saying it's more important to keep people in this loop of trying to succeed, always be striving towards something, than it is to actually get code written. And like, you're at work to write code. Like, that should be your number one priority. And in a lot of cases, that means you should be spending less time at work. Another example of this is how it affects open source projects, and actually really all projects. If you're too passionate about the code that you're writing, if you're too tied to it, it's going to be very difficult for you to accept other people's opinions and other people's feedback, and you're going to get kind of a reputation as, you know, somebody people don't want to work with. But more importantly, your code is going to get a reputation as being associated with you, and if people think that you're gatekeeping the code that you've written and you're going to react like this when they submit a pull request, they're not going to submit a pull request and your code is going to suffer. But speaking of open source tools and other tools, let's talk about right answers, because that's where a lot of this kind of nasty behavior comes from, is this notion that some kind of correct answer exists, that somewhere out there there's something that's objectively and provably right to whatever question we're trying to answer, and that we can find it. And so I'll just jump right into an example. So let's talk about JavaScript templating. This is something I've worked on a lot, and this is kind of the path I've taken through the topic. I started with something called JTemplates, which was basically just concatenation, but you didn't have to actually physically do the concatenation anymore, which was sweet. Then I moved on to the jQuery templates plugin, which is exactly what it sounds like. Then I moved on to Mustache, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. Yeah? Okay, great. And then finally, where we are today, which is getting templates with whatever framework you happen to be using. So this has kind of gone back and forth over the years. JTemplates was independent. It was a standalone piece of software that you had to, you know, implement however you implemented it. jQuery templates obviously existed as part of an ecosystem. It worked with all the other stuff in jQuery's libraries. Then people were like, oh yeah, well, we don't want that. We don't want to be stuck with jQuery, so we're going to go to Mustache because it works on the server and there's versions for Ruby and for all these other languages, and that's great. And then people kind of went back the other way, and they said, we want to, you know, use whatever the framework we're using and have everything be idiomatic. And the thing is, at the end of the day, every single one of them does the same thing. They all use JavaScript to produce HTML. How they do it, like, as somebody who has spent a lot of time arguing about templates, like, I feel really comfortable standing up here and saying it doesn't matter. Like, if you're worried about speed, you can do it on the server. If you're worried about getting a bunch of crap in your HTML, I mean, I guess you just don't use React or Angular or whatever, but it makes absolutely no difference. It's all essentially bike shedding. It's the kind of bike shedding that we do over everything, every little thing. We're gonna like flip-flop back and forth about what is the best way to do this, and we're gonna always have two sides to every argument, at least, minimum. And we just go around and around in circles. I mentioned at the beginning, I feel like I got called out in one of the previous talks about mentioning how long you've been doing programming, but I mentioned specifically when I started working on the web, because in that time I have seen the same discussions happen over and over again in a cycle so many times, and it's like, you realize after a while that it's always the same arguments. The same arguments are getting made, and the same result comes out of them, which is that nobody actually knows. There's no right answer. But there is one thing that matters above all of that stuff, and that always matters. It's as evergreen as the discussions about it, and that's the user's experience. So something like JavaScript templates, all the user cares about is that the HTML gets produced. They don't care how, they don't care what kind of crap is left in it or is not left in it. They just care that the HTML is ultimately there, right? So, and that's true of everything. Like, whatever is ultimately part of the finished product, that's what matters. So another example is performance. In performance, you obviously make some different choices depending on who your user is. Like if you're making a browser game, you're going to do things very differently than if you're a news site, right? And we sort of have a right answer for this, right? We have this sort of toolkit of approaches that we tend to use when we're talking about performance. Like, we want to eliminate, obviously, poorly performing code. I mean, unless of course it's something that we're only going to use once and we need a really clever hack that would be non-performant if we had to run it more than once, but we know for sure that we don't. Okay, or we don't want to make a bunch of requests, like unless we do because we can't package things up because they're going to expire at different rates than each other. Well, we want to get whatever we can from cache, unless we don't because we need the brand new information from something that we can't possibly cache. And don't block loading, unless of course we want to make sure that everything's loaded before we allow the user to do anything because everything has to work in concert. Again, it comes down to good judgment. In every single case, there is actually no correct answer, even with something like performance, where it's like, yes, obviously you want it to be as fast as possible. The how you make it as fast as possible is still an open question. And these kind of open questions are in literally every part of everything we do all the time. And that's what we actually do. Like, that's where we're actually working. We're working down with those questions, trying to figure them out, trying to answer them as best we can, but not answer them permanently, not answer them for everyone for all time. We produce something that isn't really code, that is the best of what we do. It's not the things we type into the computer, it's the thinking that goes on around them. And all of that thinking is kind of the product of our experience and what we're doing in service of the problem we're solving at the time. And I think people get really hung up on this notion that like there are these people who just make it look natural. They're such good coders and they're so amazing. And really those people don't exist and they can't exist. Because the things that make a great coder are, if you look at them, like the things that allow you to be a great coder are things that anyone can do and most people do. Most people have learned to do these things before they get out of like basic education, let alone, college that would, teach them the syntax of programming or any other thing related to code. Like you don't even really need that because the things that we mostly do are things that have nothing to do with the applied science of computer programming. And most of them boil down to two things, which are problem solving and communication. Both are equally important, but both are things that any person that you got off the street can do and probably does do, just not in the context of typing JavaScript into a computer. But one thing that definitely doesn't help you become a better coder or improve your coding is arguing about editors and the kind of stuff that we spend most of our time online as coders doing when we're not physically writing code. There's a lot of crap that goes on that has absolutely no impact on anything to do with our jobs. And we tell ourselves that it's part of being in these communities, it's part of improving our craft, but it has nothing to do with it. It's sort of like this shared ritual that we go through, and we just do it for tradition's sake. But I'm going to go further than that, and I'm going to say that if you want to actually write great code, the best thing to do is to stop coding. These are my hot code tips for you. Number one, go for a walk. This is proven to increase your brain activity. You get a little smarter every time you go for a walk, so go for a walk outside. Make some friends, because your friends will tell you things about your users, hopefully, because hopefully your friends are not people who are all exactly like you, and they can say things that you didn't consider. By extension, also read a book, because books can tell you about people who you might never meet, they can tell you about cultures you might never experience, places you might never go. Also, if you read literature, your ability to empathize actually goes up temporarily, so that's great for considering your users. Watch the news. See what the world that your code is going to function in looks like and how it's going to change, because context matters a lot, especially with technology that changes as fast as the things we work on. And finally, make something physical, because craft is craft, and it's amazing how well it translates over mediums, like baking a cake or building a dorm frame. These things will teach you about how you're actually building your software, and they will allow you to consider things that you didn't consider before because you're too focused on the code. But even if you don't do any of those things, just don't be myopic about what you're building. Don't focus solely on the code or solely on the product. for heaven's sakes. Because then you get something like this. Like, when the Apple Watch was first announced, people had a really big question about whether it was going to work for people with dark skin or people with tattoos on their wrists. And it struck me that Apple didn't answer this question. Like, I still don't know the answer to this question. I said I was going to look it up after the last time I gave this talk, and that was a lie. I didn't do that. But I still want to know. But it doesn't matter to me, actually. Because Apple is releasing this brand new mobile device, right? And it's got one demographic who, at least in the United States, is one of the biggest users of mobile devices, African Americans. And then it's got another demographic, which is one of the biggest consumers of Apple products, hipsters. And it's not sure if its watch is going to work for either of them. And like, if it is sure, it's not saying anything. It's not comforting them, saying, yes, valued users, like, we've considered you from the beginning. Of course we've been thinking about nothing but you, our users. It made it sound like all they'd been thinking about was their fancy code and like how cool it was, and like, ooh, we put our code in a watch. It's like, yay. That may be true, that may not be true, but that was the impression it gave me, and now that's all I can think about when I think about the Apple Watch. Maybe a more direct example is open source projects again. This is a whole thread about how, I forget, somebody can't do something because you should just focus on the code and don't focus on anything else. And then a bunch of people saying, I can't focus on the code and not focus on anything else because now I know you hate me. And then a bunch of other people saying, it doesn't matter if I hate you, you should just focus on the code, and back and forth and back and forth. And I don't remember what this is about because there's like 14 zillion of these things. There are so many now on GitHub, and it's always the same argument. And interestingly, all these people are writing all these comments, right? And no coding is getting done at all while all of this is happening. And somebody could have probably just changed a pronoun somewhere, and like that would have been the end of it. But also, they've lost contributors, also, obviously, and there are more far-reaching effects. And why? Like, because they focused too much on the code, because they insisted that it was all about the code and the code was the only thing we're thinking about. So anyway, getting back to this myth of the natural programmer, I would argue that anybody who makes it look natural, it's just because they've already thought about what the problems that are going to occur. And to do that, like, you have to remember that there are people who are going to use your code. There's a context that your code is going to exist in. Like, there are all these factors that are outside of your control. And so when you start thinking about it that way, your code is something that lives within an environment, lives within a context. I think you have a much better chance at kind of anticipating the problems before they occur. And you might think that I'm trying to trick you into doing design, which I am, but not really trick you because you've already been doing it. You couldn't possibly code without doing some design work. And that's true of building anything. If I'm framing a door and I don't design at all, then I just end up with a bunch of boards that I've hammered together, like, and they don't do anything. If I've done just enough design to kind of get the idea that I'm framing a door, then great, I've got a door, but maybe the door can't swing the right way, or maybe it's the wrong size for the opening in the house. And if I've done a little bit more planning, then maybe I've got a door that swings the correct way, but like it covers up a bathroom because I didn't know there was a bathroom there. I don't know. Anytime you're building something, you want to see as much of the big picture as possible, and that's part of your job. Like, that's part of your job as a coder. And again, it's more important than the stuff you type into the text editor. Basically, the human experience you have is a lot more useful to you, whether you see it that way or not, than the code experience you have. And it's because you can look at things beyond just like what does this hello world need to do, and you can see what the context of the hello world is. But anyway, speaking of human experiences, making a living is a pretty big and important one. Because you can be as passionate as you want, but that's not going to give you a paycheck you can take home at the end of the day. There's no reward for passion. There's no financial metric associated with it. You just have to be passionate or not be passionate, right? But actually coding, actually having a job, hopefully you can get some money out of that. And to kind of frame that, like, I think you can put it into Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so like you've got your physical stuff, and then if you've got your physical stuff, then you can start to feel safe. If you start to feel safe, you can start to build relationships. If you build relationships, you can start to get people's esteem, and then you can worry about your code. And really you can't fit that in any sooner. And I think that a lot of people want to paint it like, you know, again, the quote at the beginning, who's had the least sleep and the most takeaway food, like code is down here, but it's not, and it can't be sustainably. Like we've kind of like whether you agree with this particular model or not, like it's sort of obviously true that code is very much an abstract concern that has little to do with the things we actually need in our life. And that's to say nothing of how, you know, that hierarchy of needs evolves over the course of your lifetime. I mentioned before, like, what happens after like 15 years of writing web code and how much you start to see the same things over and over again. And like, it kind of gets replaced, and like you really, I think, stop caring about the code itself, and you care only about what that code is doing. What is that code enabling? And that becomes your concern. And the code is just a means to an end. But there's a problem with talking about it like that. It's stigmatized to say, oh, I just code as a job. Like, just coding as a job is probably one of the best things you can do in terms of writing code and getting good code written. Because if we're all living in capitalist societies, which I think is most of us in this room, we have to have jobs. Like, we can't not make a living. And if we want to keep those jobs, we have to be accountable. And I want to note that this is not the same as like the guilt or peer pressure you might feel working on an open source project where there are people just asking you for things all the time. There's no reward for doing them except that people don't yell at you anymore. It's a little bit different. In a job, there's a business arrangement. There's a trade-off. You get some money in return for a certain number of hours. And so if you want to make code important, like, why would you not want that accountability attached to it? I think just a job, like, is one of the worst ways to stigmatize the work that we do, because it's completely erroneous. Like, when it is a job, it's valuable. Like, it's valuable enough to be a job. But it's hard to think of it that way when you're acting like you're gonna get rich and cash out at 30 or 40. And I don't think a lot of us consciously believe this, but it's a pervasive myth. Like, we still often act like it. There's still sort of this like kind of back of your mind notion of like driving a sports car, like popping a bottle of champagne. Like, that's gonna happen to all of us if we just stay in the tech industry long enough. And like, I don't really actually know anybody who that's happened to. I don't know if you guys do, but it's definitely pretty rare. I can say that. What's more likely to happen is that you will get some sort of return investment on your passion, believe it or not. So if you, let's say you can keep it going. Like, you can sort of survive the gauntlet of meritocracy, and you can kind of keep like thumbs upping the emperor's new clothes, and you can keep going until probably your 40s. And then after that point, no matter how much passion you display, people are going to start to judge your passion for you. And they're going to be like, oh, well, you're just not the same young person you used to be. You're not the same go-getter. And so your salary is going to taper off. Or you can just like switch into management or some other career path, I should say, within tech that doesn't require as much passion, and kind of, you know, keep it kind of steady, keep growing a little bit. Or you can burn yourself out in your 30s and leave tech entirely and go become like a motel maid or something. I don't know. So the best thing to do is to plan on a modest success, because the reality is for most of us, there is no path to like enormous riches, sports cars, Dom Perignon. Like, that's just not in the cards for most of us with this career. There are 18.5 million coders in the world. And we're not all going to get rich. Like, most of us are going to be lucky to have comfortable careers. And the way we do that, the way we maintain that, because believe it or not, this is kind of an ageist industry, and having a career that only lasts until your mid-30s is not so much the traditional definition of a career. It's about continuing to produce good code. And that's more than just, something you type into a computer. As I keep saying, there's a lot more to it than that. If you want to write good code, you have to do it in context. And that means you have to have a life outside of it. You have to do something that respects the fact that you're a person and that benefits from the fact that you're a person. There's always going to be somebody to fight with. There's always going to be, somebody who's doing it wrong, and there's always going to be another way that maybe you should try because maybe you're doing it wrong. Like, those questions are never going to be answered. There's no answer to those questions. All there is the practical solution that you have in front of you that either works or doesn't work. And if you think that getting engaged in those battles and searching constantly for the right answer is what's going to make the difference, is what's going to get you remembered in the history books, if you saw this talk before, Don't Cheat, who knows who Dean Edwards is? Wow, okay. Okay, thank you, somebody knows. There was a time when if we were at a web development conference and I asked you that question, every hand would have shot up, I think, because there was a time when everybody needed a tool that he wrote, and I'll let you Google it yourself. But it's amazing to see how, like in, I think, less than 10 years, maybe less than 5 years, I don't know, definitely less than a decade, like somebody can write something extremely powerful, extremely important, and then nobody remembers who they are. So keep that in mind when you're like, okay, I'm going to stay up late. I'm going to stay up till 4 a.m. for a month straight working on this tool, and then I'm going to open source it. Like, probably nobody's going to remember. And I'm not talking about like the entire world. Like, it's not going to be like you're Kanye. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about even within your own profession, even within your own peer group. All that matters is what's useful, because you may not know who Dean Edwards is, but I bet you can all name the first single-page application you used. I bet you can all name the pieces of technology, the effects, the results that were life-changing to you. And like, that may not get you like name recognition, but it's something important that you did if you've worked on something like that. And like, that's probably the most we can aspire to as programmers. And it's kind of just like any other job in the world. For most of us, that's what it is. There's no shame in that. But that's one of the most important things to protecting it and to doing well at it, is acknowledging that. And I will close with something completely unrelated, which is a funny tweet that I saw. And I don't know if you guys saw this, but that's all. Thank you.
It's quite interesting because Dean Edwards, I hired him to work on a project with us, and he was incapable of working in a team because he was just this guy who came up with a great solution and wanted to throw it out, and that was it. And he chose to get into obscurity. His server, his website was running on a machine in his kitchen in London, and he never wanted to be at conferences. He was always pissed off when he had to speak, and it was quite interesting to see that his dream came true. That way, he's now unknown, and he was the one that did the first attach event overload. So basically, when you needed to support IE5 and IE55 and other horrible things, to have events on and anything on the page, you didn't have to write all the code for all the different browsers. So that was the big win back then. There was a massive competition where 20 people wrote a function, and his was the shortest and easiest to use. Mine was not, sadly enough. I have a lot of problems with the talk, and I know you wrote it because of that. Because I understand where you're coming from, but to me, passion is mostly for myself. So when you compare it, how much money will your passion make? Of course it will not make much money, but it will make me happier doing the thing that I do and doing it faster because I do it. I think we need to differentiate between passion and obsession. Because a lot of passion can turn into obsession about something very quickly. When I love my pipe code or my command line code much too much and tell everybody else is terrible when they don't understand it or not as good as I am, that to me is not passion. That to me is obsession about something.
I would make a different distinction. I think that we need to differentiate between passion that is like intrinsic and exploitation. Like, because it's one thing if like you're passionate about something, you're like, yeah, I know it's not going to make me any money, but like I get a lot of like warm fuzzy feeling from it. And there's another thing if you're passionate about somebody, but somebody else is making a lot of money out of transforming your passion into an obsession, let's say. I think you have to be skeptical about that, and I think that we all have to start kind of protecting ourselves against that because it happens over and over again.
Yep. Doesn't that partly negate the idea of open source? Because somebody will make a lot of money with your open source software that you were passionate about.
I don't think so. I would say that there's enough benefit spread out. Like it's not like you're doing it for one single person. If you have one employer, one person who you're beholden to, or one power user of your open source software who's like cracking the whip, then I think you have to start asking questions. If it's open source, like you can definitely take that too far. But yeah, I would say that falls more into the kind of distinction that you want to make.
Yeah, I think one thing hit home with me, because I'm now 40, and I'm now a senior program manager, although I still code, but I do it when I want to, and I do it to teach other people how to code. And every day people ask me, how much do you code? And if you don't do it, then you're not cool enough anymore. You're like, great. There is not enough of our market, I think, hasn't grown up enough to give us a career goal that is past being a coder. Like every company has like 5 levels of promoting people, and when you become a lead engineer or a head of programming department, then you have to come up with random job titles like architect, which nobody can define. And then you have to go into management sooner or later, and that's something. What can we do about this? Where do you think could we change that?
I think we need to have a longer run up for starters. Like I've seen people become a senior engineer 3 years into their career, and so I think having a clear idea of what seniority means to start with, and like what sort of progress can actually be made beyond just like now you have enough experience to not have to look up, what the function keyword is or something like that, would be helpful, and that would be a good place to start. But like really, I mean, like if you actually like an architect of buildings, like how do they level up? Like I think that's a problem of creative work, and like I think we have to acknowledge that it's creative work, and that like you can't be like a senior novelist. You're just a novelist. Like you write novels.
Yeah, that's not by chance. My Twitter handle is CodePoet. I think coding to me is writing. It's not about algorithms. It's about using the syntax and enjoying it and writing wonderful solutions with it. And if your solution doesn't have an outcome for end users that make their lives easier, then you've kind of wasted your time. Well, thanks very much.